So good afternoon. My name is Hernando Rojas. I'm the director of the School of Journalism and Mass Communication here on campus. And it's my pleasure today to introduce Hector Amaya, who's going to be talking to us today about violence, anonymity in the Mexican blogosphere. Hector Amaya is professor of communication and director of the Annenberg School for Communication and Journalism at the University of Southern California, where he also serves as associate dean for diversity, inclusion, and equity. Hector was born and raised in Mexico. He began his education at the Universidad Autónoma Metropolitana in Mexico City, studying visual communication. He then pursued a master's degree at the University of Calgary and a PhD at the University of Texas, Austin. Hector has researched and published extensively on the ways people use media to connect to and disconnect from political and social structures. He pays particular attention to issues of globalization, immigration, and mobility. Today's talk is related to his most recent book, Trafficking Narcoculture in Mexico and the United States. In this book, Hector analyzes the role violence plays in structuring the public sphere, tackling emerging media technologies and the restructuring of information distribution alongside more traditional media outlets. He seeks to show how violence configures public conversations in terms of what gets talked about, how things are talked about, and who gets to talk. Ultimately, how violence institutes boundaries for public life. Hector argues that emerging media create spaces where bilateral trust might not be present, and this breaks down one of the fundamental requirements of publicness: trust that we will pursue mutual persuasion rather than violence. For Professor Amaya, publicness is a broken tool, one that suffers from contingent insularity rather than an equalizing force in the public sphere. He contends that publicness is a byproduct of coercion and exploitation, one that needs to be re-theorized if it is to be useful. Professor Amaya argues that recognizing violence as a structural force of the talking field is a fundamental step in order to avoid its idealized views. This is a very provocative statement for those of us working under the Habermasian logic of the public sphere, one that needs to be engaged as we develop new understandings of the public sphere and its evolution. Hector, it's great to have you here with us today, and hopefully soon in a non-digital format. Welcome.
Thank you, Hernando, and thank you everybody for being here. It's an honor to be here. I've never been to Wisconsin, Hernando, so in the future, let me know if I can come and join you for this or that. It would be a pleasure.
We will definitely remedy that, and we will invite you in January.
Thank you, thank you. Well, and I want to thank in general also the Latin American, Caribbean, and Iberian Studies program, and Professor Rojas and Professor and Alberto as well, Professor Vargas and Sara for inviting me, for allowing me to be here and share my research with you guys. And today's presentation began as a case in the book that Hernando introduced called Trafficking, which was just published last summer. And I began this book some time ago when the violence in the north of Mexico had escalated to a point where I could not ignore it, even from the United States. Most of the cities in crisis were in the region I grew up, which made the news about the violence something that I could not simply experience as a spectacle. The news felt personal, and the pain of learning about my region's descent into violence was rooted in biography, not some sort of cosmopolitanism. Let me be clear about it here. My desire to write on the subject began as a desire to intervene with my craft in the violence. I imagine that if I could think of something, anything really, to help ameliorate the horror, then my work would be worthwhile. Great books were being written by policy experts, by political scientists, by journalists, but the perspective from a humanist, culturalist, and a local were and still are relatively rare. So engaging, however, with the literature quickly brought me my first big lesson. There is something about violence that is particularly difficult to engage as an object of research. Particularly if violence is close to your heart, our first impulse, I believe, as researchers is to try to do something about it and to try to figure out things that may reduce the violence. That was certainly my first impulse when I came to this project. And the more I read, the more I found this same impulse in most people writing about violence. Most people writing about violence engaged violence as an ethics of care, as a way of extending care to others. And while I identify with this ethics, the results tended to be highly prescriptive and highly normative. And the prescriptions were not that different. For instance, in the case of Mexico, the prescriptions typically are end corruption, of course. Improve the Mexican legal system, yes, of course. Create more professionalized police corps, yes. Eliminate poverty and social marginalization, create better methods of investigation. Did I mention end corruption? In many ways, the resulting book is the outcome of this first insight. I decided that for my own good, I needed to explain my own normative impulses, my own desire, and even my hope that my research would ameliorate the culture of violence. Where did my normative impulse came from? I first hypothesized that it was firstly an intellectual and affective habit rooted in the very craft of thinking about culture, politics, and violence. To explore this hypothesis, I needed to connect today's massive violence in Mexico and the culture it inspires to foundational normative ideas about the modern nation state. And the vehicle for this query was publicity theory, what Hernando mentioned, a theory crafted as a way of explaining the birth of modernity and of politics, and the way culture and the media technologies are central to the project of Western liberalism and deliberate politics today. With publicity theory, I am referring to ideas that place talk, deliberation, rhetoric, debate, and the constitution of publics at the very center of the democratic project. Publicity theory was, I believe, a good target because it seemed also the place from which my very own normative feelings came from. So for today's presentation, I used the case of the anonymous blogosphere in that spirit. I used it to engage more centrally with anonymity, a modality of publicity that I find very complex and so compelling that the book I'm writing right now is exclusively about anonymity. And I'll be happy to answer questions about the current book I'm writing in the Q&A. But let's start by placing ourselves in context. By the way, as you can see, I'm using a different modality of presentation with Zoom. So I'm still getting familiar with this. So if I'm clunky at times, forgive me. So let's think about the context, okay? So Mexico, okay? The 14th largest economy in the world. A nation that in the year 2000 experienced a democratic opening that gave us a great deal of hope in the future. In 2006, on the dawn of another presidential election that continued our political hopes, Mexico was transformed almost overnight from a nation flirting with first world status to one defined by violence and organized crime. This violence has been everywhere, not simply because some calculate that roughly 500,000 Mexicans work in one way or another for drug cartels, not simply because the violence has touched millions of Mexicans and killed roughly 300,000, but also because the violence has dominated our public sphere, our entertainment industries, and our political rhetoric. So the case I bring today is a case in which digital technology, citizenship, and violence meet. Is a case of a famous blog called El Blog del Narco. And this is an unusual blog that was published thousands of the most grotesque and frightening images and videos known to humankind. Bodies are displayed in horrific ways in the midst of intense suffering. By the way, I have images that are harsh. I may go very quickly through them, but right now you can avert your eyesight for the next minute. I'll let you know when these images are gone, okay? So bodies are displayed in horrific ways, and in the midst of intense suffering, waiting, frightened for that to happen. There are videos of decapitations, executions, and dismemberments. It's awful. The Blog del Narco published news and commentary, but it is best known for publishing violence, gruesome violence, and it has become a true repository of the horror of the drug war in Mexico. And even though pain and shock and even trauma cannot be avoided when interacting with this blog, El Blog del Narco has been one of the most famous blogs in and from Mexico. And the reasons are complex. But here I want to highlight the type of fame that El Blog del Narco gathered among some Mexican and international observers who admire it, because it dared to fulfill an informational gap in an extremely dangerous context. Against the grain of a narcissistic blogging culture that Sisi Papacarisi, for instance, argues interpolates its citizens as consumers. Think about the blogging culture in that way. This blog seems to contribute to a public sphere in the hope of heightening civic engagement. Because the context is so dangerous, the blog is anonymous. And today I want to analyze this anonymous publicity. So firstly, what is El Blog del Narco? El Blog del Narco is not one, but several blogs and websites that, according to their DNS provider, originated from 2008 to 2010 in Mexico. All of these domains connect to Monterrey, Mexico, and to the same email address, suggesting that all of these are or were owned by a single person or organization. It is, however, unclear who has managed or authored these blogs, or even whether they have been managed or authored by the same people. Now, the levels of activity of each of the domains changed throughout the years. One of these domains became the iconic Blog del Narco, and this one was created in 2010, and for 3 years it was the most important, one of the most important websites reporting on the drug war in Mexico. It is still there, but it's inactive. That means that you go there and the videos are no longer working, the photos are no longer there, just the text. At the height of its fame and influence, the blog received between 2 to 5 million visits per week and would often find itself in the top Mexican news sites. This particular site stopped publishing in 2013, shortly after its alleged author, who calls herself Lucy, published an anonymous book detailing her work and her goals. Violence has shaped the El Blog del Narco, not simply because of the violent content they publish. The specter of violence has shaped how the blog is made, dictating the necessity to making it anonymous. As relevant acts of violence have marked, like giant signposts, the blog's popular standing. For instance, on September 13, 2011, the bodies of a young woman and a man who had collaborated with the El Blog del Narco and other social media, including Twitter, appear hanging from a bridge in Nuevo Laredo, Tamaulipas. She hung from her hands and feet, was tortured semi-nude and disemboweled. He hung from his hands with a cut on his side so deep that you could see the bones. On the bridge and around the bodies were these yellow posters referred to as narcomantas, stating, "This is going to happen to all of those posting funny things in the internet. You better fucking pay attention, I'm going to get you." These two victims had tweeted and blogged about drug violence and participated in sites like the Blog del Narco. The sign was signed by the Zetas, a violent splinter cartel that has tried to control Nuevo Laredo for some time now. 11 days after the body of journalist and blogger Maria Elizabeth Macias was found, decapitated, also in Nuevo Laredo, with the signature of Los Zetas, according to the Narcomanta, which is on the screen right now, Macias was killed by her comments in blogs and in Twitter. On top of her body, the killers left keyboards, a mouse, and other computer parts strewn across her body. In an interview in 2013, Lucy declared about being highly traumatized by these events as they dramatically reminded her of the precariousness of the situation. The death threats to her and her partner were constant. That year, I began cobbling together her interviews, books, and blog comments and writing. And together, this allowed me to paint the following picture. Lucy is a young woman in her mid-20s who created the site as a way of filling the informational gap in cities like Monterrey, where violence was rampant, but reporting was scarce. Single, without children, and patriot, Lucy repeatedly claimed that her actions had the goal of correcting the global perception of Mexicans as corrupt, as uneducated, and as violent. The blog quickly acquired multiple sources, including cartel members, and was labeled by some as a public relations forum for drug dealers. Lucy pushed back against these characterizations. She argued that without El Blog del Narco, people would not be able to find their loved ones, for no other site or publication is willing to show the type of material they show. So what for us is a graphic image of an execution, for instance. For a family, it's a painful reminder that, or painful evidence that they will never see their loved ones again. The blog was under attack from the beginning, not only by the cartels, but they also experienced these cyber attacks from the Mexican government. I quote, "We change where we live every month. We've been in places, we've been in basements. It is very difficult. We hide our equipment in different places. If the authorities get close, we run," end of quote. This was not a paranoia, of course, as the killings in 2011 and the dozens of attacks and threats on reporters, blogs, and Twitters showed. The cartels and some members of the Mexican state will go simply to great lengths to control the public sphere. What does it mean that civic and political work needs to be carried out in secret? What does it mean that anonymity is accepted as part of civics? Now, contemporary uses of publicity, particularly in disciplines concerned with expressive culture, such as media and communication and journalism and studies, they show a huge bias towards defining publicity in relationship to openness. There is a general belief that publicity does what it does to our political lives because publicity exists in the open. In fact, I dare to say that most of us confuse public with open, or argue for what I consider it a privileged connotation. If it is public, then it is meant to be seen, to be open, without walls, like a speech delivered in the Greek agora, which, not coincidentally, is a model many use to especially think the concept of publicness and the realm in which publicness is performed, the public sphere. It is certainly the way Hannah Arendt, for instance, uses public in the human condition, and it is ultimately true in the work of Jürgen Habermas, which Hernando referenced. What does the normative element of openness implies in terms of publicness? It means that to be public, one must be willing to place oneself in the open. Publicness thus tends to be conceived as a spatially reflexive action, as a willingness and perhaps even a desire to make oneself visible. Yet, this normative idea of publicness, like the biased notion of an open public sphere, imply a number of theoretical and historical concessions that cannot be taken for granted. Let's start with the grounded notion that most of us recognize Lucy's work as publicness, even if it is anonymous. And let's try to figure out how is it that anonymity came to be part of our civic lexicon. So I want to probe a bit deeper and explore the tensions inherent between civics, publicity, and anonymity. And the easiest way to do this is by pointing out that early publicity was often anonymous, and that anonymity has been a productive protocol for communication in all societies. Anonymity yields secrets, and scholars like Judy Dean, for instance, remind us secrets are the very justification to publicity. I'm quoting Judy Dean here. The people have a right to know. Well, I'm quoting 1,000. That is the slogan of contemporary ideas in politics and on information, and it is thus the uncovering of secrets that democracy and the information age connect. It is thus unsurprising that when Yochai Benkler, for instance, starts his book Wealth of Networks with a statement of faith and says, I quote, information, knowledge, and culture are central to human freedom and human development, end of quote. This is an almost mystic belief in information and openness. And because of ideas like this, the unveiling of secrets has become central to our civic and informational imaginaries. It would be easy to believe that we value publicity simply because publicity promises the elimination of secrets, but secrets have a more complex constitutive role in publicity. And it is not Habermas or Arendt who will help us figure this out. The clues to this are in the historiographical work of Reinhard Koselleck, who, much like Habermas, traces the rise of publicness from feudalism to the present in Europe. In Koselleck, the move from feudalism to enlightened forms of state organization could not happen without new forms of social consent, and publics gave shape to a new form of social consent during absolutism, the middle step between feudalism and the modern nation state. Early publics appear in secret societies, communities in which politics was held to moral standards. These secret societies, like the Masons, the Illuminati, the Cosmopolitans, and others, appear because the same cultural and technological conditions that had in the 16th century fueled religious plurality in Europe. The multiplication of discourse made easier by the printing press, the rise of the mercantilist classes, and the emergence of printing and vernacular forms. As many have noted, these cultural and technological forces were the conditions of possibility for pluralism and modern citizenship. So, before the coffee houses and salons that Habermas describes, secret societies constituted communities of dialogue without hierarchy. These lodges attracted the new classes of people that were acquiring economic and social capital, like the merchants, the new professionals, the bureaucrats. These groups were gaining social and economic power, but had no power to shape politics. In the absolutist state, these groups needed the spaces to come together, the spaces that could allow them to share critical views about society and about the state. These secret societies were those places that fostered criticism and political dissent on one condition: secrecy. Secrecy was required, for in the absolutist state, dissent was dangerous to the dissenter. Now, Koselleck's work is a useful reminder that the value of opacity, of secrecy, of anonymity, of privacy in contemporary political cultures is rooted in these early experiences and organizations. So when Thomas Paine anonymously publishes and distributes Common Sense in 1776, he is following simply the protocols of survival and political morality, of absolutism. The uses of disguises by the Sons of Liberty in the American colonies did the same. Since early modernity all the way to the present, anonymity remains a tool of the saint and revolution. Pen names and pseudonyms had been normal to critical discourse. Even the US Constitution was published anonymously early on. Historian Michael Kimmade has noted that a great number of editorial pieces in the 17th and 18th century were written under the guise of pen names. And pen names were vital to the public discourse of the American Revolution. Benjamin Franklin went as far as suggesting that the colonies ought to be covered by anonymous writing. Recognizing these practices in relationship to moral and legal impunity, Franklin added that pseudonyms, quote, enable men of honor to behave dishonorably, end of quote. Similar ideas and practices were used in Mexico's War of Independence, In the important months preceding the armed rebellion of 1810, anonymous flyers, broadsides, graffiti, and cartoons were found in important public spaces across the New Spain and definitely in the capital, Mexico City. Timothy Henderson writes about these efforts, including the awful punishment to anyone caught doing this anonymous publicity. Imagine, in 1810, the Inquisition in Mexico set up a force of detectives to chase down malefactors. Hand-operated printing presses were outlawed, and rewards were offered for information leading to the arrest of dissidents. As they had in other nascent modern nation states, anonymity in Mexico was a tool of revolution, and the values of anonymity were grafted deep in the Mexican political imaginary. In nations like the United States and Mexico, nations born out of revolution and colonialism, anonymity became entwined with heroic narratives, as anonymity was a communicational tool central to the birth of these nations. It is this myth of origin that has helped people characterize Lucy's anonymous work as an example of civics, citizenship, and a heroic communicational act. Civics and heroicity. How do these connect to anonymity? Let me try to explore this issue of Lucy's heroicity using the work of Hannah Arendt and Selah Ben-Habib. In The Human Condition, Arendt develops seminal ideas about publicity in modernity that she anchors on the analysis of Greek life. Arendt argues that publicity is possible only through the coming together enabled by language and human communication, which makes possible social arrangements free of violence. To be political, to live in a polis, meant that everything was decided through words and persuasion and not through force and violence. In Greek self-understanding, to force people by violence to command rather than persuade were pre-political ways to deal with people characteristic of life outside the polis. Clearly, the Greeks were also very concerned with avoiding polis and violence and finding methods of social interaction that would eliminate it. Violence existed, but not in the sphere of politics, which was ruled by talk, rhetoric, and the ideal of shared understanding. Yet, as Ben-Habib has noted, Arendt's ideas about publicity are not without complications. To begin with, she used not one, but two models of publicity. In the Greek city, the public realm was permeated by a fiercely agonal spirit, where citizens had to be constantly distinguishing themselves through their deeds and achievements. It is a realm eminently dramaturgical, like in the theater, the space of heroes. And it is not a space meant to be homogeneous, but a stage full of different values that allows some actors and some voices to protagonize debates and positions. This topological thinking is also theatrical, meant to foster passion, thought, and action. This, Ben-Habib notes, is agonistic publicity. But there is a second type of publicness, an associational view of public space that in Arendt's is more conducive to positive political outcomes. This associational type of publicity manifests anytime people act together in concert and is part of Arendt's conceptualization of power, force, strength, and violence. Now, the notion of a public hero, the type of public heroism that some have tried to cast on Lucy, is at home in Arendt's topological, dramaturgical, and agonistic conception of publicity. Lucy claimed that she attempted to reveal the dark, bloody secrets of Mexico's drug conflict. And in the process, she attempted to conquer a style of preeminence, a high point, if you wish, a stature from which she can share with others her views for a better Mexico. In this agonistic space, the textured drama of life necessitates actors who use loud and perhaps even spectacular forms of personal display and action in order to command attention. Without attention, the message is lost. Ben Habib's concerns with violence, Ben Habib's concern was not violence, but the separation between private and the public, okay? And her arguments have stood the test of time. Yet violence is not simply the fulcrum that allows the public to exist and that should be dismissed once the public is established. Violence, I argue, is too an activity that should be, using Ben Habib's term, phenomenologically de-essentialized. Violence simply does not neatly stay outside the walls. And in most places around the world, particularly in Latin America, violence interpenetrates the public realm. Lucy's story does not end with her promotion to civic hero by the international community. In May 2013, only weeks after Lucy had revealed her work to the public, her colleague, the webmaster who helped her with the technical side of the website, called her one last time and simply said, "Run." No one has heard from him since. After hiding for a few days, Lucy fled to the United States and then to Spain. A few days later, she contacted via Skype the writer who had previously interviewed her for The Guardian and revealed to him her state of panic and loneliness. She was staying in a boarding house with enough money to last a few months, but was otherwise without contacts and almost without identity in a country, Spain, not her own. Carol, the journalist, wrote, quote, "Her biggest fear is she will see her colleague appear on a video of the type that frequently appear in their blog. Battered, interrogated, gazing into the camera, knowing a terrible fate awaits." End of quote. Her stay in Spain did not improve. She wrote, quote, "Yet it has been a mistake to come to Spain. I know Spain is a great country, but sadly I wasn't aware of the great relationship it has with Felipe Calderón Hinojosa. I accept that it was a mistake." A couple of weeks later, Lucy started a personal blog in which she wrote about her quest to survive. Lucy wrote about her struggles, her hunger, the sense of betrayal she had lived with, her dreadful opinions about the Mexican political system, in particular President Calderón. On July 2013, she published an angry letter asking the international community to help her leave Spain. She seemed aware that her civic quest was understood through a different register than the work of other famous new media political stars like Cuban Ioannis Sanchez or Edward Snowden. She believed that she had not received any help because, quote, "I am Mexican and not Cuban, like Ioannis Sanchez, or US American, like Edward Snowden." Casting her profile against the politicized identities of Sanchez, who is a human rights advocate from Cuba engaged in a quest to promote political change, and Snowden, whose identity as a whistleblower against the US government has been lionized, Lucy's efforts against cartels and corrupt Mexican politicians gave her no political platform from which to springboard herself into international stardom. Even though the threats on her life were more certain and more terrible than the risks on Sanchez or Snowden, Lucy's quest does not fit the parameters of stardom that had become norm in internet celebrity culture. On July the 22nd, 2013, a request for funds to get out of Spain was issued by Lucy in the crowdfunding site Capipal.com. According to the site, she was able to collect 500 euros, or if you prefer, a pittance. Arendt sheds light on Lucy's failed odyssey, the betrayal that mars her last work in public. When Arendt discusses what Benjamin refers to as the agonistic public realm, She centers her argument on the nature and pairing of action and speech. The actions that distinguish those who deserve to be in public are actions always followed by or explained by speech. It is through action and speech that individuals reveal their uniqueness and their identity, their difference vis-a-vis the world. Self-disclosure, therefore, is key. And perhaps Arendt is right that a hero needs to be in the open, have a face. Lucy's actions, her speech, are quickly becoming erased from memory and were already insufficient in 2013 to incite significant response. This lack of response to Lucy is rooted on the type of mediation she used in her anonymity, which became the productive tactic and emblem of the danger in which she existed. That is, in the process of embracing anonymity, however, her actions lost the ability to transcend and are bound to be forgotten. But why does anonymity have this effect? Arendt's heroes existed in the age of orality. The agonistic realm that she sketches for us is also indebted to her ideas on orality. So the courageous act of self-disclosure central to publicity was courageous not because, like Hector's fate, showing oneself in public would mean certain death. In the public realm that Arendt presents to us, Achilles is not waiting, only a stronger debater who will leave sword behind but not reason. So in the political imaginary constructed by Arendt and reproduced in most theories of publicity, orality underscores the nature of our courage one must embrace when entering the public realm. This is a courage that trusts the basic safety of those in public. The public realm is a contest of speakers, not killers. Its heroes engage in a war of ideas, not bullets. Lucy's public role could not be truly open. Her heroicity, if that is what we need to call it, could not be attached to her identity, like in the case of Snowden or Sanchez. She could not trust the visitas to El Blog del Narco. And as she powerfully narrates, her day-to-day activities were carried out by hiding in fear, by moving from location to location, and by never revealing who she was or where she was. While it worked, her anonymity allowed thousands of contributors and commentators to share their experiences and views about and with the drug violence in Mexico. But eventually this stopped working. She had to run. Her partner was disappeared. She had to hide, and she had to stop using digital technology. And without ongoing activity, without exposing her life to danger, Lucy's pleas quickly became alienating. Those of an unknown author and one that will quickly be forgotten. But she's not forgotten yet. And I want to take one more lesson from Lucy's Odyssey. Like Lucy, I believe that anonymity is not anathema to publicity. Secrets have uses in the public sphere, and not only when administered by and within legitimate institutions like journalism or the state security apparatus. In a world besieged by pluriform violence, the a priori of politics can no longer be the Hobbesian maxim that the state should have a monopoly on violence, or that the state should have a monopoly over secrets. The base of politics should be, like Lucy foresaw in her darkest hour, and enacted in her stubborn, inadvisable, and dangerous reporting of violent events, a collective imagined street by street, not in the scale of a state or a nation. Thank you.